In the autumn of 1943, beneath the stone floors of a small Catholic church in occupied France, something impossible was happening. The air in the underground wine cellar smelled of gunpowder instead of aged Bordeaux. The rhythmic crack of rifle fire echoed off ancient brick walls that had stored sacramental wine for 2 centuries. And standing in the center of it all, wearing a black cassock stained with dirt and oil, was Father Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a 42-year-old parish priest who had never fired a weapon in his life until 6 months ago. Now he was teaching farmers, shopkeepers, and teenagers how to kill German soldiers. The transformation of this sacred space into a clandestine training ground was not just an act of rebellion. It was an act of war hidden beneath the most unlikely disguise, sanctified by a man of God who believed that sometimes salvation required damnation. The village of Saint-Rémy-sur-Loire sat in the heart of the Loire Valley, a patchwork of vineyards and medieval stone that had survived plagues, revolutions, and the First World War. Before the Germans arrived in June of 1940, life moved at the pace of the seasons. Father Moreau was known for his gentle Sunday sermons, his love of classical music, and his insistence on maintaining the church's 500-year-old wine cellar, where bottles lined the walls like sleeping sentries. The cellar descended 3 levels beneath the nave, a labyrinth of tunnels dug by Benedictine monks in the 1500s. It was cool, dark, and utterly forgotten by everyone except the priest and the oldest parishioners. When the Wehrmacht rolled through the village square with their half-tracks and machine guns, they saw what occupiers always see: another French church, another compliant population, another place to extract resources and enforce obedience. They never thought to look beneath the altar. The occupation changed everything slowly, then all at once. At first, the Germans were disciplined, almost polite. They requisitioned grain and livestock, posted sentries at crossroads, and warned against resistance. But by 1942, the brutality became routine. Public executions in the town square, mass deportations of Jews and communists, forced labor conscriptions that emptied villages of young men. The Vichy government collaborated eagerly, handing over lists of names, enforcing curfews, turning neighbor against neighbor. Father Moreau watched his congregation shrink as families fled or disappeared. He performed funerals for boys shot for curfew violations. He heard confessions from women raped by occupying soldiers. And every Sunday, he climbed into the pulpit and preached about forgiveness, even as rage built inside him like pressure in a sealed vessel. The turning point came in March of 1943, when the Gestapo arrested 15 villagers suspected of sheltering a downed British pilot. They were tortured in the town hall basement. 3 died. The pilot was never found. Father Moreau made his decision that night. He had spent his entire adult life preaching nonviolence, turning the other cheek, rendering unto Caesar. But Caesar was burning his world, and turning the other cheek only exposed your neck to the knife. He sought out Marcel Dufresne, a former French army sergeant who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp and returned to Saint-Rémy to work his family's vineyard. Marcel was already connected to the nascent resistance, moving weapons and intelligence through the countryside. When the priest proposed using the church cellar as a training facility, Marcel stared at him in disbelief. A church, the most surveilled building in any occupied village, the one place Germans might actually respect. It was either insane or brilliant. Father Moreau made his case simply. The Germans would never suspect it. The tunnels provided multiple escape routes, and the thick stone walls would muffle the sound of gunfire. Most importantly, he had moral authority. If the priest was involved, locals would trust the operation. The first training session took place on a moonless night in April. 6 men arrived separately, slipping through the graveyard and entering through a side door that led directly to the cellar stairs. Father Moreau had spent weeks preparing. He moved 300 bottles of wine to a hidden antechamber and constructed makeshift shooting lanes using sandbags stolen from a German construction site. Hay bales served as backstops. Candles provided minimal light. The weapons were a mixture of British Sten guns, old French rifles, and German Mausers taken from dead soldiers. Marcel did the actual instruction while Father Moreau stood watch, rosary in hand, listening for patrols. The sound of gunfire underground was muffled but not silent. It sounded like distant thunder, like God clearing his throat. After 2 hours, the men left the way they came, carrying the muscle memory of how to load, aim, and fire. Father Moreau locked the cellar door, climbed the stairs to the nave, and knelt before the crucifix, wondering if he had just committed a mortal sin or the most righteous act of his life. Over the next 6 months, the wine cellar beneath Saint-Rémy became a ghost. 217 men and 34 women trained there in shifts, learning urban combat, sabotage, and guerrilla tactics. They practiced throwing grenades made from stolen German ordnance. They learned how to clear jams from British submachine guns. They memorized the layout of nearby German installations. Father Moreau became a quartermaster, smuggling ammunition in coffins during funerals, hiding detonators inside hymn books, using confession booths to pass intelligence. He never fired a weapon himself, but his hands were stained with the same sin. The Germans suspected nothing. They attended mass, requisitioned wine for officers' parties, and even posted sentries outside the church to protect it from looters. They never imagined that beneath their boots, the seeds of their destruction were being planted one bullet at a time. The system worked because it was built on layers of deception so mundane that no occupier would think to question them. Father Moreau maintained his regular schedule with obsessive precision. He celebrated Mass every morning at 7, heard confessions on Wednesdays and Saturdays, visited the sick on Thursdays, and hosted Bible study on Tuesday evenings. The Germans saw what they expected to see: a middle-aged priest going through the motions of a dying faith in a defeated country. What they did not see were the coded messages embedded in his sermons, the way certain hymns signaled training sessions, or how the communion wine deliveries concealed shipments of ammunition. The church had become a theater, and every parishioner was an actor playing the role of the compliant occupied. The performance was so convincing that a German lieutenant once thanked Father Moreau for his cooperation and donated funds to repair the church roof. The priest accepted the money with a gracious smile and used it to buy more sandbags. The structure of the operation was cellular by necessity. No trainee knew the full extent of the network. They arrived in small groups, never more than 8 at a time, staggered across different nights to avoid patterns. Marcel Dufresne handled the tactical instruction, teaching marksmanship, weapons maintenance, and small unit tactics he had learned in the French army. Father Moreau managed logistics and security, coordinating schedules through a network of trusted parishioners who acted as lookouts and couriers. The trainees themselves came from every corner of occupied life. There were farmers who had lost their sons to labor conscription, school teachers who had been forced to teach German propaganda, shopkeepers who watched their inventory stolen to feed the Wehrmacht, young women who had seen their friends dragged away to forced brothels. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary people who had reached the limit of what they could endure and decided that dying with a weapon in their hands was preferable to living on their knees. The training itself was brutal and efficient. Time was the enemy. Each session lasted no more than 3 hours, and every minute had to count. The first hour focused on weapons handling, loading, unloading, clearing malfunctions, and basic marksmanship at distances of 10 to 25 meters. The cellar's confines made long-range practice impossible, but most resistance engagements happened at close quarters anyway, ambushes on rural roads or assassinations in narrow alleys. The second hour covered tactics: how to move without being seen, how to set up a crossfire, how to withdraw after contact. Marcel was ruthless in his criticism, screaming at trainees who exposed themselves or failed to maintain discipline. The third hour was psychological preparation. Marcel described what it felt like to kill another human being: the weight of the trigger pull, the sound of impact, the smell of blood mixing with cordite. He wanted them to understand that war was not romantic. It was butchery dressed in necessity, and if they were not prepared to become butchers, they should leave immediately. No one ever left. The cellar itself became a living archive of resistance. The walls were covered with hand-drawn maps of German positions, patrol schedules, and supply routes. One corner held a collection of captured German documents, identity papers, travel permits, and requisition orders that could be forged or altered. Another section stored medical supplies stolen from German field hospitals, including morphine, sulfur powder, and bandages. The deepest chamber, The one that once held the church's oldest vintages now contained a small arsenal: 23 rifles, 14 pistols, 9 submachine guns, and enough ammunition to fight a sustained engagement. Every weapon had been smuggled in piece by piece, hidden in farm carts, fishing boats, and even baby carriages. Father Moreau kept an inventory in a leather-bound ledger disguised as a church registry. If the Germans ever found it, they would see only a record of baptisms and deaths. They would never know that each entry corresponded to a weapon, a trainee, and a date. The secrecy held because the consequences of exposure were absolute. Everyone involved understood that discovery meant torture and execution, not just for themselves but for their families. The Gestapo had perfected the art of collective punishment, burning entire villages in response to partisan activity. In the neighboring town of Oradour-sur-Glane, 642 civilians had been massacred in reprisal for a resistance ambush. The message was clear: resist and everyone dies. Yet the training continued night after night because the people of Saint-Rémy had made a calculation that the occupation had forced upon them. They could live as slaves and die slowly from humiliation and starvation, or they could fight and die quickly with their dignity intact. Father Moreau, the man who had once preached about the sanctity of life, now presided over a school for death. He no longer questioned whether this was God's will. He had decided that if God existed, he would understand. The first real test of the Cellar's effectiveness came in July of 1943, when a German supply convoy was ambushed 15 kilometers outside Saint-Rémy. The attack was executed by 12 men who had trained in the church basement, and it was devastatingly successful. They used a felled tree to block the road at a narrow bridge, then opened fire from both sides with coordinated precision. 3 trucks were destroyed, 17 German soldiers killed, and a shipment of weapons and medical supplies captured. The ambush lasted less than 4 minutes before the attackers melted back into the countryside. The German response was immediate and savage. They locked down the entire region, established checkpoints on every road, and began house-to-house searches in surrounding villages. 2 towns were selected at random for reprisal actions. 32 civilians were executed in public squares as examples. The occupiers wanted blood, and they wanted the resistance to know that every German death would be answered tenfold. Saint-Rémy fell under intense scrutiny during the crackdown. German patrols tripled in the village. The Gestapo set up a temporary headquarters in the mayor's office and began interrogating residents about suspicious activity. They were looking for weapons caches, safe houses, and anyone connected to the resistance network. Father Moreau knew that discovery was now a matter of probability rather than possibility. Every training session became a gamble with death. But stopping was not an option. The ambush had proven that the training worked, that ordinary people could be transformed into effective fighters. More importantly, it had given the village something it had not felt in 3 years: hope. People walked differently after hearing about the convoy attack. They made eye contact with German soldiers instead of looking at the ground. The psychological impact was as important as the military one. The occupation thrived on fear and submission, and every act of resistance chipped away at that foundation. Marcel and Father Moreau adapted their security protocols immediately. Training sessions were reduced from twice weekly to once every 10 days, and group sizes were cut in half. New countermeasures were implemented. A parishioner who worked as a cleaning woman in the German headquarters would light a candle in her window if a raid was imminent. The church bell would ring at odd hours to signal all clear or abort codes. Father Moreau began sleeping in the rectory with his clothes on, ready to flee at a moment's notice. The entrance to the cellar was camouflaged further with a false wall of wine racks that could be quickly repositioned. Escape routes were mapped and rehearsed. If the Germans breached the cellar during a training session, the plan was to fight their way out through the tunnels that connected to the graveyard and the river beyond. Everyone understood it was a suicide option, but it was better than capture. The psychological toll on Father Moreau began to show in ways he could not hide. He lost weight. His hands developed a tremor that made holding the chalice during Mass difficult. He started drinking the communion wine between services, not for sacrament, but for sedation. His sermons became shorter, more abstract, as if his mind was always elsewhere, calculating risks and contingencies. The other priests in the diocese noticed the change and expressed concern, but Father Moreau deflected their questions with vague references to the stress of occupation. What he could not tell them was that he was living two lives simultaneously, and the contradiction was tearing him apart. In the daylight, he was a shepherd comforting his flock and preaching forgiveness. In the darkness, he was a conspirator teaching people how to kill. He had become a hybrid creature that belonged to neither world, sustained only by the belief that his sins would be weighed against the lives he was helping to save. The intelligence network that supported the Cellar operations expanded organically as more people became involved. The baker's wife monitored German patrol schedules by noting when officers came for their morning bread. The postmaster intercepted and copied German communications. The village doctor treated wounded resistance fighters and reported which German units were being rotated out due to casualties. This information flowed to Marcel, who used it to plan operations and avoid German strengths. Father Moreau served as the central node, the one person everyone trusted, and the only one who knew the full scope of the network. It was a dangerous position, because if he was ever captured and broken under torture, the entire structure would collapse. He carried a cyanide capsule in his cassock pocket, a gift from a resistance operative who had stolen it from a captured SS officer. Father Moreau prayed every night that he would never have to use it, but he also prayed for the courage to do so if the moment came. By September of 1943, the wine cellar had trained over 150 people, and the resistance network in the Loire Valley had evolved from scattered amateurs into a coordinated guerrilla force. The trainees from Saint-Rémy were now forming the backbone of sabotage cells across 3 departments, disrupting rail lines, cutting communication cables, and assassinating collaborators. The German occupation authorities began to sense that something had changed in the region, that the passive compliance they had enjoyed was eroding into active hostility. Intelligence reports noted an unusual concentration of partisan activity around Saint-Rémy, but they attributed it to the dense forests and rural terrain rather than a single training facility. The village itself remained a model of cooperation, paying its requisitions on time, providing labor details when demanded, and showing no outward signs of resistance. The deception held because Father Moreau understood that the best disguise was normalcy, that the Germans were looking for obvious signs of rebellion and would overlook the mundane. The logistics of maintaining the operation grew increasingly complex as the network expanded. Ammunition consumption became a critical problem. Each training session used hundreds of rounds, and resupply was unpredictable. British airdrops were the primary source, but they depended on weather, moon phases, and whether the RAF could spare the planes. Father Moreau began rationing ammunition like a miser, limiting each trainee to 30 rounds per session and emphasizing dry fire practice and tactics over live fire. Marcel supplemented supplies by raiding German positions, a dangerous practice that sometimes yielded more weapons than ammunition. The food situation was equally challenging. Trainees needed to eat after sessions, but increased food consumption in a starving village would attract attention. Father Moreau solved this by organizing charity drives ostensibly for poor parishioners, then diverting portions to feed the resistance. The moral gymnastics required to justify stealing from the hungry to feed fighters weighed on him, but he rationalized it as a necessary sin in service of liberation. The human cost of the operation remained hidden from public view, but haunted those who knew the truth. 3 trainees had been killed in action by September. 2 more had been captured and executed after failed operations. Their families were told they had died in work accidents or from illness, lies that protected the network but compounded the grief. Father Moreau performed their funerals with the full ritual of the church, knowing that he had sent them to their deaths as surely as if he had pulled the trigger himself. The guilt was crushing, but it was also clarifying. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He was no longer a priest who occasionally helped the resistance. He was a resistance commander who occasionally performed priestly duties. The transformation was complete, and with it came a cold pragmatism that would have been unrecognizable to the man he had been 3 years earlier. The relationship between Father Moreau and Marcel Dufresne had evolved into something deeper than partnership. They had become brothers in a cause that demanded everything and promised nothing. Marcel, the former soldier, brought tactical expertise and a ruthless efficiency that kept people alive. Father Moreau brought moral authority and organizational genius that held the network together. They argued constantly about strategy, about acceptable losses, about how far they could push before the entire structure collapsed. Marcel wanted to be more aggressive, to strike harder and more frequently. Father Moreau urged caution, warning that every success brought increased German scrutiny. Their debates often lasted deep into the night in the cellar, two men sitting among weapons and wine, trying to calculate how many deaths were acceptable to achieve liberation. They never reached agreement, but they respected each other enough to find compromise. That mutual respect was the foundation upon which the entire operation balanced. The psychological warfare aspect of the operation was something Father Moreau had not anticipated, but came to understand as essential. Every German soldier killed, every supply line disrupted, every act of sabotage sent a message to both the occupiers and the occupied. To the Germans, it said that France was not defeated, that resistance was alive and growing stronger. To the French, it said that collaboration was not inevitable, that fighting back was possible. The propaganda value sometimes exceeded the military value. When a German colonel was assassinated by a trainee from the cellar, the immediate tactical gain was negligible, but the psychological impact was enormous. The Germans implemented harsher curfews and increased patrols, which only increased resentment and drove more people toward the resistance. Father Moreau began to see the occupation as a system that could be destabilized not just through violence, but through persistent, calculated acts of defiance that forced the Germans to overreact and reveal their brutality. The wine cellar was not just producing fighters. It was producing a contagion of resistance that spread through occupied France, one trained partisan at a time. The breaking point came in early November of 1943, when a captured resistance fighter broke under Gestapo torture and gave up fragments of information about a training facility connected to a church. The intelligence was incomplete, lacking specific names or locations, but it was enough to trigger a systematic investigation of every religious institution within 50 kilometers of recent partisan activity. Saint-Rémy was on the list. Father Moreau received warning through his network that Gestapo teams were conducting surprise inspections, arriving at churches without notice and searching every room, every cellar, every hidden space. He had perhaps 72 hours before they reached Saint-Rémy. The decision he faced was binary and brutal: evacuate the cellar completely and hope the Germans found nothing, or prepare for a final confrontation that would end in death for everyone involved. Marcel argued for evacuation, for preserving the network and relocating the training operation to the forests. Father Moreau understood the logic, but also understood that emptying the cellar meant abandoning the one advantage that had kept them safe: the church's sacred status as an unlikely hiding place. They compromised on a middle path that bought time while preserving deniability. Over 2 nights, working in shifts, they moved the most incriminating evidence out of the cellar. The weapons were disassembled and buried in the graveyard inside waterproof containers marked with false headstones. The ammunition was distributed to safe houses across the village, hidden in root cellars and barns. The maps and documents were burned, the sandbags were emptied and the sand scattered. The shooting lanes were dismantled. What remained was a wine cellar that looked like it had been used for storage, with dust-covered bottles, old furniture, and the accumulated debris of centuries. It was not perfect, but it might pass a cursory inspection if the Germans were not specifically looking for a training facility. The risk was that any serious search would reveal inconsistencies. The newer sandbags stacked in corners, the smell of gun oil that lingered in the air, the scuff marks on the floor where equipment had been moved. Father Moreau spent an entire day artificially aging the space, spreading dust, arranging cobwebs and strategically placing wine bottles to create the impression of benign neglect. The Gestapo arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-November, 3 cars and a truck, carrying 12 men led by an Obersturmführer named Klaus Reinhardt. He was a professional, methodical and thorough, the kind of officer who had built his career on breaking resistance networks. Father Moreau met them at the church entrance with a performance of surprised cooperation, offering to show them anything they wished to see. Reinhardt was not interested in pleasantries. He deployed his men systematically, searching the nave, the rectory, the bell tower, and finally demanding access to the cellar. Father Moreau led them down the stone steps, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand brushing against the cyanide capsule in his pocket. The cellar was dark and cold, lit only by the flashlights of the Gestapo agents. They moved through the space with professional efficiency, examining the walls, testing the floors for hollow spaces, opening bottles to verify they contained wine. Reinhardt himself spent 15 minutes in the deepest chamber, the one that had held the arsenal, studying the walls and floor with intense concentration. The inspection lasted 2 hours, an eternity measured in shallow breaths and forced calm. Father Moreau answered questions with practiced innocence, explaining that the cellar had been in his family's care for generations, that it was rarely used anymore because the war had made wine production impossible, that he sometimes came down here to pray in solitude. Reinhardt listened without expression, occasionally making notes in a leather journal. He asked about recent visitors to the church, about unusual activity in the village, about whether Father Moreau had noticed anything suspicious. The priest deflected each question with vague responses, invoking his duty to protect the confidentiality of confession, expressing dismay at the violence in the region, and offering to pray for the souls of the German soldiers killed by terrorists. It was a masterclass in controlled deception, every word calibrated to project innocence while revealing nothing. Reinhardt seemed unsatisfied, but found no concrete evidence. The cellar appeared to be exactly what it claimed, an old wine storage space in a rural church, dusty and forgotten. As the Gestapo prepared to leave, Reinhardt turned to Father Moreau with a look that communicated more than words. He did not believe the priest's performance, but he also had no proof to justify an arrest. He warned Father Moreau that the region was under close surveillance, that anyone aiding the resistance would be executed along with their families, and that the church's protection would not save traitors. Father Moreau received the warning with a solemn nod, promised his full cooperation, and watched from the church steps as the German vehicles drove away. Only when they disappeared from sight did he allow himself to breathe fully. The cellar had survived inspection, but the margin of safety had collapsed to nothing. Marcel arrived within the hour, and they made the decision together. The training operation would go dormant for at least 2 months, long enough for German attention to shift elsewhere. It was a tactical retreat, painful but necessary. The weapons would stay buried, the network would stay quiet, and Father Moreau would return to being just a priest, waiting for the moment when the wine cellar could once again become a school for liberation. The 2 months of dormancy felt like suffocation. The network that had been so carefully built, that had trained over 200 fighters and coordinated dozens of operations, was forced into paralysis while the occupation ground forward unchecked. German convoys moved through the region without harassment. Collaborators operated openly without fear of retribution. The momentum that had been building toward liberation stalled, and with it came a creeping despair among those who knew the truth. Father Moreau maintained his cover with mechanical precision, performing Mass, hearing confessions and visiting the sick, but inside he was screaming. The idle time gave him too much space to think, to catalogue his sins, to wonder whether God could forgive a priest who had turned a house of worship into an armory. He stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night, kept awake by nightmares of German soldiers pouring into the cellar during a training session, of the tortured screams of captured fighters, of the village burning in reprisal. Marcel checked on him weekly, urging patience, reminding him that survival required discipline. But patience was a luxury that felt obscene when people were dying every day under occupation. The decision to resume operations came in late January of 1944, driven not by strategy, but by necessity. The Allied invasion of France was coming, everyone knew it, and the resistance needed to be ready to support the landing with coordinated sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Intelligence from London indicated that D-Day would happen sometime in the spring or summer, and every resistance network in France received orders to intensify preparation. The directive was clear: train more fighters, stockpile more weapons, identify more targets. For Father Moreau and Marcel, this meant reopening the wine cellar despite the risks. They implemented new security measures, rotating training locations between the cellar and remote forest camps, and screening new trainees with even greater paranoia. The weapons were exhumed from the graveyard in stages, brought back piece by piece to avoid detection. The cellar was reactivated slowly, cautiously, like a wounded animal testing its limbs after hibernation. The first session back had only 4 trainees, veterans who needed refresher training. By March, they were back to full operations, running sessions 3 times a week with groups of 6 to 8. The spring of 1944 brought a new urgency and a new brutality to the occupation. The Germans knew the invasion was imminent and responded with scorched earth tactics, executing suspected partisans without trial and implementing collective punishment policies that made entire villages responsible for resistance activity. The stakes had never been higher, and Father Moreau felt the weight of every decision he made. Each person he trained was a life he might be sending to execution. Each operation he supported risked bringing destruction down on Saint-Rémy. Yet the alternative was to do nothing, to let the occupation continue unchallenged, to abandon the people who had risked everything based on his leadership. The moral calculus had become impossible, a choice between sins with no righteous option. He chose action over paralysis, damnation over cowardice, because at least action felt like resistance against the suffocating inevitability of evil. The training curriculum evolved to meet the demands of the coming invasion. Marcel shifted focus from basic marksmanship to advanced tactics, ambush techniques, demolitions, close-quarters combat, and coordination with Allied forces. Trainees learned how to read maps, use radio equipment, and identify strategic targets like bridges, rail junctions, and communication hubs. The cellar sessions became more intense, more demanding, pushing people beyond what they thought they could endure. Marcel was preparing them not for isolated acts of sabotage, but for sustained guerrilla warfare against a retreating enemy that would be desperate and vicious. Father Moreau watched the transformation of ordinary villagers into hardened fighters with a mixture of pride and horror. These were his parishioners, people he had baptized and married and buried, now learning how to plant explosives and conduct battlefield triage. The war had forced them all to become something other than what they were meant to be, and there was no going back to innocence. The relationship between the church and the resistance became increasingly symbiotic and increasingly dangerous. Sunday Mass became a venue for passing intelligence, with coded phrases embedded in hymns and prayers. Confession booths served as dead drops for messages and small weapons. The church's legitimate activities provided cover for an underground railroad that moved Allied airmen, escaped prisoners, and Jewish refugees through the region towards safety. Father Moreau was no longer just running a training facility. He was operating a complete resistance infrastructure disguised as pastoral ministry. The scope of the operation terrified him, because every expansion meant more people at risk, more potential points of failure, more opportunities for betrayal. Yet it also meant more lives saved, more Germans killed, more disruption of the occupation machine. He had become a strategic asset in a war he never wanted to fight, using the moral authority of the church as both shield and sword. The contradiction would have broken him if he allowed himself to think about it too deeply, so he stopped thinking and simply acted day after day, trusting that history would judge whether his sins were justified. June 6, 1944, arrived like a thunderclap that shook the foundations of occupied Europe. The Allied invasion of Normandy had begun, and within hours, coded messages from London flooded resistance networks across France with a single directive: execute Plan Vert, the coordinated sabotage campaign designed to cripple German reinforcements moving toward the beaches. For Father Moreau and the fighters trained in his wine cellar, this was the moment everything had been building toward. The weapons were distributed from their hiding places. The targets were already identified and surveilled. The teams were organized and ready. Over the next 72 hours, the trainees from Saint-Rémy executed 18 separate operations across the Loire Valley. They derailed 3 trains carrying German armor toward Normandy. They destroyed 2 bridges, forcing convoys onto secondary roads where they could be ambushed. They cut communication lines and sabotaged fuel depots. The cumulative effect was chaos in the German rear, delaying reinforcements by critical days while Allied forces consolidated their beachhead. Every hour of delay meant more Allied soldiers survived, more equipment landed, more ground secured. The wine cellar's legacy was being written in burning tanks and derailed trains. Father Moreau did not participate in the operations directly, but he coordinated from the church, receiving reports through couriers and relaying intelligence to Marcel, who commanded the field operations. The risk of exposure was now irrelevant because the entire region had erupted into open warfare. German patrols were ambushed on every road. Collaborators were executed in public squares. The fiction of occupation control evaporated as France rose in rebellion. The Germans responded with predictable savagery, burning villages suspected of harboring partisans and executing civilians in reprisal. Saint-Rémy avoided immediate retaliation only because the Germans were too occupied fighting on multiple fronts to conduct systematic revenge operations. But Father Moreau knew it was only a matter of time. The village's role in the resistance would eventually be discovered, and when it was, there would be no mercy. He spent his days preparing for that inevitability, hiding evidence, creating false identities for key operatives, and planning evacuation routes for the most vulnerable. The German garrison in Saint-Rémy began to collapse in late June as the military situation deteriorated. Units were pulled north to reinforce the Normandy front, leaving behind only a skeleton force of older soldiers and wounded veterans. The occupiers who remained were demoralized and frightened, aware that the war was turning against them and that every resistance fighter they faced might be the one who killed them. The power dynamic that had defined the occupation for 4 years inverted almost overnight. The Germans, once arrogant and untouchable, now moved in armored convoys and refused to patrol alone. The French, once submissive and terrified, now walked the streets with barely concealed contempt. Father Moreau watched the transformation with grim satisfaction, but also with growing dread, because he knew that cornered predators were the most dangerous. The final confrontation was coming, and it would be violent and absolute. The breaking point arrived on July 14th, Bastille Day, when the resistance decided to make a symbolic statement by attacking the German garrison headquarters in the center of Saint-Rémy. Marcel argued against it, calling it unnecessary and tactically foolish. The garrison was already defeated, reinforcements were weeks away, and attacking them would only provoke a massacre. But the decision came from higher in the resistance command structure, from men who wanted a propaganda victory as much as a military one. 32 fighters, 26 of them trained in Father Moreau's cellar, assembled in the pre-dawn darkness to assault a fortified position defended by 48 German soldiers with machine guns and artillery support. Father Moreau knew it was suicide disguised as heroism. He tried to intervene, pleading with the commanders to call it off, but he was overruled. His role had always been to train and supply, not to command. As the fighters moved into position, Father Moreau returned to the church and knelt before the altar, praying for a miracle he knew would not come. The assault began at dawn with explosions that shattered windows across the village. The resistance fighters attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, using the tactics Marcel had drilled into them in the wine cellar. They moved with discipline and courage, suppressing German positions with coordinated fire and advancing under cover. For 20 minutes it seemed like they might actually succeed. But then German reinforcements arrived from a neighboring town, a mechanized unit with armored cars, and heavy weapons that had been stationed nearby as a rapid reaction force. The resistance fighters were caught in a crossfire, pinned down in the open square with no cover and no escape routes. The battle devolved into a slaughter. 18 fighters were killed in the first 10 minutes of the counterattack. The survivors attempted to withdraw but were hunted through the streets by German soldiers who had abandoned all restraint. By noon, 29 of the 32 attackers were dead. The 3 survivors fled into the countryside, wounded and traumatized. The Germans left the bodies in the square as a warning, forbidding anyone from retrieving them for burial. Father Moreau watched from the church window, witnessing the destruction of the force he had helped create. and understood that his war was about to enter its final and most terrible phase. The German reprisal was methodical and comprehensive, designed not just to punish but to erase any trace of resistance from Saint-Rémy. Within hours of the failed assault, Gestapo units flooded the village, dragging suspects from their homes and conducting interrogations in the town square where the bodies still lay. 73 civilians were arrested in the first sweep, including the mayor, the schoolteacher, and anyone who had family members among the dead fighters. The interrogations were public and brutal, intended to terrorize the population into revealing the resistance network's structure. Father Moreau knew that under torture, someone would eventually talk, would mention the church, would describe the wine cellar. He had perhaps hours before the Gestapo came for him. Marcel appeared at the rectory near midnight, urging the priest to flee immediately into the forests where resistance fighters were regrouping. But Father Moreau refused. Running would confirm his guilt and bring destruction down on every parishioner who had helped him. Staying meant almost certain death, but it also meant he could control the narrative, could potentially shield others by accepting full responsibility. It was the last move available to him, and he would make it count. The Gestapo arrived at dawn on July 15th with Obersturmführer Reinhardt, the same officer who had inspected the cellar 8 months earlier. This time there was no pretense of courtesy. Reinhardt had spent the night interrogating captured fighters and had extracted enough fragments of information to connect the church to the training operation. He did not have proof, but he had conviction, and in occupied France that was sufficient for execution. Father Moreau was arrested in the nave during morning mass, dragged from the altar in front of his congregation, and thrown into a truck with 6 other prisoners. They were taken to the German headquarters and separated for interrogation. Father Moreau was brought before Reinhardt in a room that smelled of blood and fear, the walls still bearing the stains of previous sessions. Reinhardt did not waste time with accusations. He simply stated what he knew, that the church had been used to train resistance fighters, that weapons had been stored there, that Father Moreau had orchestrated the operation. He demanded names, locations, and details of the broader network. Father Moreau responded with silence, broken only by prayers recited in Latin, a wall of liturgical defense that drove Reinhardt into a rage. The torture lasted 3 days, though Father Moreau lost the ability to track time after the first few hours. They used methods refined through years of practice: beatings, waterboarding, electrical shocks, psychological manipulation. Reinhardt alternated between violence and false promises, offering survival in exchange for cooperation, threatening to torture the priest's housekeeper and other parishioners if he did not talk. Father Moreau endured by retreating into his faith, reciting the rosary in his mind, visualizing the faces of the people he was protecting, and clutching mentally at the knowledge that every hour he remained silent was another hour for the network to evacuate and hide. He did not break, not because he was extraordinarily strong, but because he had accepted death before the torture began. The cyanide capsule had been taken from him during the arrest, but it no longer mattered. He had already made peace with his fate. What Reinhardt did not understand, what no torturer ever understands, is that pain loses its power over someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. On the 3rd day, Reinhardt changed tactics. He brought Father Moreau, barely conscious and unable to walk, to the church square where the bodies of the fighters still lay rotting in the summer heat. The entire village had been forced to assemble under armed guard. Reinhardt announced that Father Moreau was guilty of terrorism and treason, that he had used the church to wage war against Germany, and that he would be executed as an example. But first, the church itself would be destroyed. German soldiers entered the building with gasoline and explosives, methodically preparing to raze the structure that had stood for 5 centuries. Father Moreau, kneeling in the dirt with his hands bound, watched the preparations with a strange calm. The church was just stone and wood, he told himself. The real church was the people, the network, the resistance that would continue after he was gone. The building could burn, but the spirit could not be killed. He looked at the faces of his parishioners, saw their grief and rage, and used his last strength to speak loud enough for them to hear. He told them that faith required sacrifice, that God saw their suffering, and that liberation was coming. He told them to remember not his death, but what they had achieved together. He told them to survive. The execution was scheduled for noon, but it never happened. At 11:45, artillery fire erupted from the east, and within minutes the village was engulfed in a firefight. A combined force of resistance fighters and Free French troops, supported by American forward observers calling in strikes, had launched a coordinated assault to liberate Saint-Rémy. The Germans, already depleted and demoralized, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against an enemy that knew every street and building. Reinhardt made the tactical decision to withdraw rather than defend an indefensible position, ordering his men to fall back to a stronger position 20 kilometers north. In the chaos of the retreat, Father Moreau was forgotten, left bound in the square as German trucks raced out of the village. Marcel found him there 30 minutes later, barely alive but conscious, surrounded by the bodies of the fighters he had trained. The priest looked up at his friend and asked a single question: "Did the cellar survive?" Marcel nodded. The church was damaged but standing, and the wine cellar beneath it was intact. Father Moreau smiled, closed his eyes, and lost consciousness. The battle for Saint-Rémy was over. The war would continue for another year, but the wine cellar had served its purpose. Father Moreau spent 6 weeks recovering in a makeshift field hospital established by the Free French forces in a manor house outside Saint-Rémy. His injuries were severe: broken ribs, internal bleeding, nerve damage in his hands from the torture, and an infection that nearly killed him twice. He drifted in and out of consciousness, attended by doctors who had learned battlefield medicine in the chaos of liberation. Marcel visited daily, bringing news of the war's progress and updates on the surviving members of the network. The Allies were pushing eastward across France, liberating towns and cities with increasing speed as German resistance collapsed. The fighters trained in the wine cellar were now integrated into regular Free French units, serving as scouts and liaison officers, their guerrilla experience proving invaluable in the fluid combat of the advance. 27 of them had survived the war so far. 41 had died in various operations between June and August. The mathematics of sacrifice were brutal but undeniable. For every fighter killed, dozens of Allied soldiers had been saved, and hundreds of German reinforcements had been delayed or destroyed. The wine cellar's contribution to liberation could not be measured in military terms alone. It had given people agency in their own salvation, had transformed victims into warriors, had proven that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances. The village of Saint-Rémy itself bore the scars of occupation and liberation in equal measure. The church had been partially burned during the German retreat, the nave blackened by fire and the roof collapsed in sections. The wine cellar beneath had survived intact, protected by centuries-old stone and luck. When Father Moreau was finally strong enough to walk, Marcel took him to see it. They descended the familiar stairs in silence, the priest leaning heavily on his friend's arm, and stood in the darkness where so much had begun. The shooting lanes were gone, the sandbags removed, the weapons long since distributed. What remained was an empty stone chamber that smelled of damp earth and old wine, a space that held no evidence of what had transpired there. Yet Father Moreau could see it all: the faces of the trainees, the sound of gunfire muffled by thick walls, the whispered conversations about tactics and courage. He could see the transformation of ordinary people into extraordinary fighters, the alchemy of fear converted into resistance. Marcel asked if he regretted any of it: the lives lost, the church damaged, the sins committed in the name of liberation. Father Moreau considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said that regret was a luxury for people who had choices, and that under occupation, the only real choice was between submission and resistance. Everything else was details. The question of Father Moreau's status within the church became complicated after liberation. The bishop of the diocese had heard rumors of the priest's activities and demanded an explanation. The use of a consecrated church for military purposes, the violation of sanctuary, the direct participation in killing, all of these raised canonical questions that could not be easily dismissed. Father Moreau was summoned to the diocesan office in early September, still weak from his injuries, but required to account for his actions. He expected condemnation, perhaps even defrocking, but what he received was something more complex. The bishop listened to his confession in private, hearing the full scope of what had been done in Saint-Rémy. When Father Moreau finished, the bishop sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. He said that the church had failed France during the occupation, that too many clergy had chosen collaboration over resistance, and that Father Moreau's actions, while technically violations of canon law, were morally justified given the extraordinary circumstances. There would be no formal punishment, but there would also be no celebration. The church could not publicly endorse armed resistance by clergy without undermining its role as a mediator and peacemaker. Father Moreau would be allowed to continue as a priest, but the story of the wine cellar would remain unofficial, a footnote rather than a headline. The physical recovery took months, but the psychological recovery never fully occurred. Father Moreau returned to Saint-Rémy in October of 1944 and resumed his duties, but he was a changed man. The tremor in his hands had become permanent, a visible reminder of the torture. He struggled with nightmares, waking in the rectory screaming about Gestapo interrogations and burning churches. He could no longer perform Mass without seeing the faces of the dead fighters in the congregation. The line between priest and warrior, which he had crossed so deliberately during the occupation, could not be uncrossed. He existed in a liminal space, neither fully one nor the other, haunted by the memory of what he had done, and unable to reconcile it with the faith he had devoted his life to serving. Marcel, who understood the weight of killing in ways civilians never could, became his closest confidant. They would sit together in the damaged church, two men who had seen too much, and talk about what they had done and whether it had been worth the cost. They never reached a conclusion that satisfied either of them, but the conversation itself was a form of survival. The wine cellar was sealed in November of 1944 by order of the provisional French government. The official reason was structural instability, but the real reason was political. The role of the resistance in liberation was being carefully curated by competing factions, and a story about a priest training fighters in a church cellar did not fit neatly into any preferred narrative. The communists wanted to claim the resistance as their achievement. De Gaulle wanted to minimize the role of irregular forces in favor of the Free French Army. The Catholic Church wanted to emphasize its moral opposition to Nazism while downplaying armed collaboration or resistance. Father Moreau's wine cellar was an inconvenient truth for everyone, so it was quietly buried beneath official history. A small plaque was placed on the church wall commemorating the village's sacrifice during occupation, but it made no mention of the training facility, the weapons, or the priest who had orchestrated it all. The fighters who had trained there knew the truth, but they were scattered across France, rebuilding their lives and trying to forget the war. The story of the wine cellar faded into local legend, a rumor passed between generations, never quite confirmed and never quite denied. Father Jean-Baptiste Moreau died in 1968 at the age of 67, having served Saint-Rémy for another 24 years after liberation. He never spoke publicly about the wine cellar, honoring the church's desire for discretion and his own complicated feelings about what had been done there. But privately, in the confessional and in quiet conversations with veterans who returned to visit, he processed the moral weight of those years. He baptized the children of fighters he had trained, performed weddings for survivors who found love after surviving hell, and buried the men and women who had carried the scars of occupation into old age. His sermons remained gentle, focused on forgiveness and peace, but those who knew his history understood the depth beneath the words. This was a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and chosen to believe in redemption anyway. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including dozens of former resistance fighters who traveled from across France to pay respects. They knew what the history books did not, that this quiet priest had been one of the most effective resistance organizers in the Loire Valley, that his wine cellar had trained over 200 fighters, and that his moral courage had helped liberate France from occupation. The truth about the wine cellar began to emerge slowly in the decades after Father Moreau's death. Marcel Dufresne, who lived until 1983, gave several interviews to historians in his final years, breaking his silence about the operation and insisting that Father Moreau receive proper recognition. Documents declassified by French and British intelligence agencies confirmed the existence of the training facility and its strategic importance in the lead-up to D-Day. Surviving trainees added their testimonies, describing the priest who had transformed a sacred space into a school for resistance and paid the ultimate price for his defiance. Slowly, reluctantly, official history began to acknowledge what had been deliberately obscured. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of liberation, the French government posthumously awarded Father Moreau the Legion of Honor for his service to the resistance. A new plaque was installed at the church, this one specifically mentioning the wine cellar and its role in training fighters. The story that had been suppressed for political convenience was finally being told, though by then most of the people who had lived it were dead. The wine cellar itself was reopened in 2008 as part of a renovation project to repair the church's foundation. Archaeologists and historians descended into the space with modern equipment, documenting what remained of the training facility. They found bullet holes in the walls, scorch marks from muzzle flashes, and fragments of ammunition embedded in the stone. They found the false wall Father Moreau had constructed to hide the entrance, still functional after 64 years. They found graffiti scratched into the brick by trainees' names and dates, and small prayers for survival. The cellar was preserved as a historical site, open to the public as part of a museum dedicated to French resistance history. Visitors now walk through the same chambers where ordinary people learned to fight back against occupation, where a priest violated every principle of his calling in service of a higher moral imperative. The space has become a pilgrimage site for those interested in the complex ethics of resistance, a physical reminder that heroism is rarely clean and that liberation requires sacrifices that history often prefers to forget. The legacy of Father Moreau and his wine cellar raises questions that remain relevant today. What are the moral limits of resistance against tyranny? When does the obligation to protect life supersede the commandment against killing? Can violence ever be sanctified if it serves liberation? These are not abstract philosophical questions, but lived realities for people facing occupation, oppression, and genocide. Father Moreau did not have the luxury of debating these questions in academic settings. He faced them in real time, with German soldiers in his village and his parishioners being murdered in the streets. His decision to transform the wine cellar was not a rejection of his faith, but an extension of it, a recognition that sometimes love of neighbor requires taking up arms against those who would destroy them. The Catholic Church has never formally reconciled its doctrine of nonviolence with the reality of clergy resistance during the occupation, and Father Moreau's story remains a challenge to comfortable pieties about peace and forgiveness. He was a man who chose damnation over complicity, who bet his soul on the belief that God would understand the necessity of his sins. The story of the wine cellar matters today because it illustrates a truth that authoritarian regimes always try to suppress. Ordinary people are not powerless. A middle-aged priest with no military training transformed a wine storage space into a force multiplier that contributed materially to the liberation of France. He did not wait for permission, did not defer to authority, did not accept the inevitability of occupation. He saw what needed to be done and did it, accepting the consequences with full awareness of the moral cost. His story was deliberately obscured because it was inconvenient, because it complicated the clean narratives that governments and institutions prefer, because it suggested that resistance was not just possible, but morally necessary. The wine cellar beneath Saint-Rémy Church is a monument to the power of individual agency, to the idea that one person with conviction can change the trajectory of history. Father Jean-Baptiste Moreau died believing he had failed, that his sins outweighed his contributions, that God would judge him harshly. History has judged him differently. He was a hero who never accepted the title, a warrior who never abandoned his faith, and a priest who understood that sometimes the most sacred act is defiance against evil, no matter the cost to your soul.